Greetings, candidates, and welcome to the lesson. The subject is Advanced Auditing and Assurance. We continue with the chapter Contemporary Issues in Auditing. In our last session, we began the discussion on the effects of pandemics on audit processes. And we did agree that the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on financial statement reporting and audit engagements are complex and have resulted in challenges for both the management and also the auditors. There has been an unprecedented level of uncertainty about the economy, about the future earnings, and many other inputs that represent fundamental elements of financial reporting. All right? For the management to prepare financial statements, then there are certain inputs that are required. Those inputs, candidates, have been shrouded with uncertainty, unprecedented level of uncertainty because of the economy, because of the uncertainty in relation to future earnings and so on. So we discussed in our last lesson that, we saw that the pandemics, and COVID just one of them, is a contemporary issue, and that the uncertainty arising from the environment, we saw that may increase the challenges in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence that is needed to form an independent view about the reasonableness of management's estimates and judgments. And that is important for the preparers and auditors to engage in discussions assessing the impact of pandemics on the financial statements. And we introduced in our last lesson the concept of remote auditing. Remote. Now, remote auditing, we defined it as a situation where an auditor uses technology to perform an audit without visiting the building where the audit client is located. The audit carries out his work remotely by use of technology to gather audit evidence in order to review conformity to an audit criteria. And while looking at the past paper that was done in December 2021, I came across question number 1A, which reads, one of the practices that has gained momentum in the recent past is remote auditing, particularly following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Required, as an auditor, describe how you would approach remote auditing from a practical perspective. 6 marks. I repeat. One of the practices that has gained momentum in the recent past is remote auditing, particularly following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Required, as an auditor, describe how you would approach remote auditing from a practical perspective. Now, candidates, this question, I'm not going to answer it, but I'll give you a hint. You can see here that remote auditing, the question reads, has gained momentum in the recent past. This paper was done in December 2021 during the pandemic. Okay? As a result of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, auditors resorted to carrying out their work remotely. In our last session, we said that the opportunity to audit remotely has always been present for auditors. But interestingly, few auditors took advantage of the opportunity to audit remotely. And I say that could be because of the force of habit, where people like, before the pandemic, to visit the client premises or locations to carry out audit procedures. It is only after the pandemic that the situation forced people to work from home, that auditors had no any other option but to also work remotely. The question here is, describe how you would approach remote auditing from a practical perspective. Now, candidates, it's important to note that whether the audit is done remotely or whether it is done on site, audit work still follows the same general life cycle. We all know the procedures or the steps that are to be undertaken while carrying out an audit. The steps do not change. And remote auditors should consider scheduling additional meetings online for maybe engagement planning meetings. The team can also have midweek team status touch points, including the end of the week wrap-ups. There could also be the issue of discussions, the issue on reviews of the audit report draft, and so on. So there has to be communication with, the auditor should ensure that there is communication which aligns with the audit process. But it should be more formal than just internal team communications. The auditor should also consider communication methods, like the email, like the phone, the virtual meetings, and so on. So auditee communication, candidates, we know, will include the kickoff meetings, the remote interviews, the weekly updates, the closing of meetings, and so on. And that the meetings should be should have a reasonable duration. All right? There has to be reasonable duration of between, say, 30 to 60 minutes. Because auditors may need to attend to several meetings with the interviewees. So when conducting a meeting, it's important to have a reasonable time frame. Other matters to consider could include remote document reviews, which can take place, which it can take significantly more time because of the need to prepare and upload documents for sharing. So the question here is, describe how you would approach remote auditing from a practical perspective. I'm giving you hints on how to answer such a question. I started by saying that remote auditing, whether it is remote auditing or auditing on site, the audit procedures, the steps in auditing do not change. Every audit has to follow certain general principles. It's only that here the auditor works remotely as opposed to working on site. So that is, the question is just 6 marks. And it's an open question. You can easily answer such a question. So today we had planned to go into the additional procedures that are required to be carried out by an auditor in order to gather sufficient, appropriate audit evidence upon which to base an opinion. So that is our today's lesson. Additional what? Additional procedures. You will recall in our last session we discussed some of the challenges that may be faced by an auditor who does his work remotely. This type of auditing has its own challenges, which may call for additional audit procedures that ought to be put in place or to be carried out in order to obtain sufficient audit evidence. And we all know, candidates, that ISF 500, that is the standard on audit evidence, requires the auditor to design and perform audit procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to be able to draw reasonable conclusions on which to base the audit opinion. That is the requirement of ISF 500. But we also know that ISA 210, which is a standard on agreeing the terms of audit engagements, the management agrees to provide the auditor with access to all the information of which management is aware that is relevant to the preparation of the financial statements. Any additional information the auditor may also request from management for the purpose of the audit, and also unrestricted access to persons within the entity from whom the auditor determines is necessary to obtain audit evidence. That is the requirement of the two standards, ISA 500 and ISA 210. Now, candidates, COVID-19 has resulted in many challenges for auditors in obtaining sufficient appropriate evidence. For example, travel restrictions, which we know impacted physical access, like attending inventory counts, the ability to obtain original documents, the availability of client staff, and so on. On the one hand, candidates, the standard, international standard on auditing 500, the standard on audit evidence requires the auditor to obtain, to design and perform audit procedures to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence upon which to draw his conclusions. ISA 210 also requires that the management should provide information, unrestricted access to information by the auditor in order to base or to gather sufficient appropriate evidence upon which to base his opinion. But COVID-19 came with challenges which caused the auditor not to be able to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence because of the restrictions. We recall during the pandemic, there were travel restrictions. You could not travel anyhow. People are forced to work from home. Companies were not operating, they were closed, yet the auditor is required to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence upon which to base his opinion. So that's a challenge, and that's why we are studying the effects of pandemic, so that you as an auditor should be able to know what additional procedures that you ought to put in place to obtain sufficient audit evidence. Now, ISA 500 explains that the reliability of information to use as audit evidence, and therefore of the audit evidence itself, is influenced by its source and by its nature, and the circumstances under which it is obtained, including the controls over its preparation and maintenance where relevant. And in a pandemic, during pandemic, candidates, obtaining audit evidence may be more challenging. It may be also be different on how to obtain it compared to the previous times when there are no pandemics. In our last session, we learned that the auditor may be, during a pandemic, may be forced to obtain information remotely. The auditor may be forced to obtain information that is not original, because remember the reliability of evidence is determined by the source, is determined by the nature. We know that original documents are more reliable than photocopies or evidence that is received on email or that is received on through video conferencing. When conducting an audit remotely, sometimes it's not possible to get original source documents. That's why I'm saying that during a pandemic, obtaining audit evidence may be challenged, and it may also be different as to compare to when there is no pandemic. So it's important for you to understand the requirements of these two international standards on auditing, ISA 500 and ISA 210. Now, candidates, it's important to note that the principles of ISA 500 still apply even when doing remote auditing. And the additional consideration by the auditor about the reliability of the audit evidence may be provided or be considered. It's important for the auditor to check if the evidence has been obtained from a source independent of the entity, okay? When gathering evidence, as we are talking about reliability, the auditor can only express an opinion based on information that is reliable. So when obtaining information during a pandemic, it's important for the auditor to check if the information that has been obtained is independent of the entity. The source should consider if the source of information is independent of the auditee, the auditee firm. Because you know, information that is obtained from the auditee firm is less reliable as compared to information that is obtained from third parties. The second consideration when determining reliability of information is if the information is generated internally or not. Internally generated. If the information is generated internally, then the auditor may need to check the internal controls of the auditee firm. Internally generated information. If it is internally generated, then what controls were in place over its preparation? If the auditor is to rely on information that is provided by the audit firm, then before relying on this information, the auditor should check if there were sufficient or proper controls that were put in place by the firm in the preparation of the information. Then consideration can also be on the if the information was obtained directly. Was the information obtained directly by the auditor? This can help determine reliability of such information. The information obtained directly by the auditor may be more reliable than information that is generated or provided by another party. Then information, is it provided in a document form or not? Because you know, information that is documented is more reliable than information that is just verbal. So when considering the reliability information upon which to base his or her audit opinion, it's important for the auditor to consider some of these matters. And then a judgment will then be needed to determine whether the evidence is reliable for the purpose for which it has been obtained. And candidates auditors will need to exercise what we call professional skepticism. Exercise professional skepticism about the evidence obtained electronically. Because if the auditor is to carry out, we've seen audit remotely, most of the information will be communicated to the auditor electronically. So when relying on electronic information, the auditor has to exercise professional skepticism. Such evidence, the auditor should not just take it as gospel truth. No, he's supposed to ensure that he has some level of doubt about that information, which can help him now to be able to carry out additional procedures in order to test the reliability of the electronic evidence in the absence of the original physical source documents. When auditing remotely, it's not possible to get the original source documents. The documents that will be availed, may be uploaded online, uploaded on email, uploaded in the cloud for the auditor to download, then to check the information. So professional skepticism is required in order to test the reliability of information that is provided electronically. Candidates, we are studying audit procedures that the auditor has to institute in order to obtain sufficient audit evidence when auditing remotely. Let's look at inventory. This is one area which we know candidates is important for an auditor to be physically present when taking physical inventory. And one practical issue that has emerged is the attendance of the auditor at inventory counts. And in accordance with ISA 501, ISA 501, this is audit evidence in relation to specific considerations for selected items like inventory. We know that inventory can be material to the financial statements, and the auditor is required to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding the existence, regarding the condition of inventory by attendance at a physical inventory count, unless it is impracticable. Inventories can be material to financial statements. The figures provided in the financial statements for inventory, the auditor has to verify. The auditor has to conduct audit procedures. One of the procedures is attending the counting, the physical counting of inventory. But that we know may not be possible during pandemics. All right? ISA 501. Audit evidence, and this is in relation to specific considerations for selected items. And I've said if inventory is material to the financial statements, then the auditor is required to do what? To obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence regarding the existence and the condition of inventory. Does the inventory exist? How do you tell inventory exists? You have to see the inventory. Is the inventory in the right condition? Is it inventory that can be used, or is it damaged, or what kind of inventory is it? That can only be verified if the auditor attends or visits the stores to check the existence and the condition of inventory, so stocks. Now, candidates, the standard requires an auditor to attend the physical stock count, but the circumstance, like a pandemic, may not allow an auditor to visit the stock count because of the situation surrounding a pandemic, like restrictions in travel. So what are the additional procedures? What procedures should an auditor put in place to ensure that the evidence of inventory is sufficient, appropriate evidence in the current environmental situation? What should the auditor do? The standard requires the auditor to be present. The pandemic, COVID, for example, 19, does not allow the auditor to travel. So what do you do as an auditor? Number one, the auditor should check if it is possible to observe, all right? To do what? To observe. Can the stocks be observed on an alternative date if attendance cannot be performed at the year end? Stock taking is done at the year end, but the question here is, it's not possible to attend the stock take. But now, is it possible for the auditor to attend the stock take at an alternative date? Alternative date other than year end. So that is one of the considerations that related to inventory and obtaining of appropriate audit evidence during a pandemic. All right? Can the observation be done at an alternative date? We are discussing whether physical inventory counts can be observed on an alternative date if attendance cannot be performed at the year end, with audit procedures on the intervening transactions performed. Another consideration is using technology. Use what? Technology. This is where the client is able to perform a physical count, but auditors are unable to attend. Can we have cameras? Can the auditor have, say, camera feeds or mobile-based video conferencing to observe the inventory count? Using technology. Instead of being present, cameras can be used, web technology can be used in order to observe real time when counting stocks. 3, perform alternative procedures. Is it possible to perform alternative audit procedures where attendance is impracticable? For example, inspection of documentation of the subsequent sale of specific inventory items acquired or purchased prior to the physical inventory counting, or reviewing and testing inventory roll forwards. It can also include obtaining assurance that the inventory location was not accessible for the period. And that can be done through, say, observing, say, camera footage Yes, the security camera footage. Those are alternative audit procedures. We are studying audit procedures. Alternative audit procedures said can be performed in order for the auditor to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Audit evidence. Reviewing documentation, because before the items were received in the stores, these items were bought or purchased. When purchasing items, they are such transactions are supported by documents. There has to be source documents, like the purchase orders, the invoices, the store sheets, stock sheets. All right, the auditor can review such documents prior to stock count. Then evidence can also be obtained from the security cameras. When the stocks are received in the store, there could be cameras that are located within the store. They can be retrieved so that the auditor can confirm that indeed the items were received in the store. And such footage can be sent online to the auditor. So those are alternative procedures in relation to inventory. Now let's discuss something else. Group audits. Group audit, additional procedures. Now candidates, ISA 600, I'm sure by now you know what ISA 600 is all about. This ISA 600 is about special considerations in relation to the audits of group financial statements, including the work of component auditors. It includes the documentation of work undertaken by component auditors in order to be able to do what? To form a basis for the group audit opinion. In order to do what? In order to base an opinion on the financial statements of the group. Now, candidates, with the COVID-19 travel restrictions in place, group auditors were not able to visit the component audit teams, where they had originally planned to do so, to evaluate and review the key audit work papers, which may cause a significant delay or an impact on the auditor's ability to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And in some situations, candidates, there could also be legal restrictions, which may also limit the transfer of data, including transfer of audit working papers. That could be maybe outside the jurisdiction of a country. There could be legal restrictions. And if it is not possible to review the necessary component audit working papers, whether in person or electronically, then the group auditor will need to undertake other measures, which will likely involve additional work, additional procedures. Group audits. ISA 600. Special considerations in relation to audits of group financial statements. ISA 600. So what are the additional procedures that the group auditor needs to put in place or to undertake in order to obtain appropriate sufficient audit evidence in order to form a group audit opinion? One is uploading files in the cloud. Uploading files in the cloud. If the auditor is not able to move, if teams are not able to move, then upload the files in the cloud with access provided to the group audit engagement team. Instead of just visiting, you can have the files in the cloud so that the team can download the files from wherever they are. Number 2, video calls. Video what? Video calls, including screen sharing. Screen sharing, video calls, screen sharing, to review the component auditor's work, or you can also use remote access. Remote access. We have applications like TeamViewer, applications like AnyDesk, TeamViewer, that support remote control, where you can access another computer using your own device. All right, you can access a computer in a distant location without necessarily visiting the location. These are additional procedures. You can also have a more detailed memorandum. More detailed memorandum. All right, that's another additional procedure. Have a more detailed memorandum or questionnaire provided to the component auditor, that is collaborated with more detailed discussions with the group engagement team. Information from the client, another procedure. From the client. Information from the client that is provided directly to the group engagement team so that they can perform their own procedures on financial information of the component. So these are some of the procedures, candidates, and I can also say that the pandemic, or we can say the current circumstances, can provide an opportunity for group audit teams to re-evaluate and potentially redesign the way in which they communicate and engage with component audit teams. In the same way that many audit teams are changing the way in which they engage with their clients. And if sufficient appropriate audit evidence cannot be obtained to enable the auditor to conclude, then the auditor will need to consider the impact on the auditor's report arising from the limitation of scope. If the auditor is not able to gather appropriate sufficient evidence upon which to gain or to make his opinion, then he may also consider the impact of such limitation. And that one was discussed extensively in the topic on audit reporting, limitation of scope. If the auditor is not able to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence, then there is limitation of scope. And that will definitely have an impact on the kind of opinion that is likely to do what? To make. So these are some of the additional audit procedures that may be needed to be carried out in relation to group audits. So candidates, that will mark the end of our today's lesson. We've explained some of the additional procedures that can be undertaken by an auditor when carrying out generally remote auditing. I've explained the requirements of ISA 500, the requirements of ISA 210. I've also highlighted some of the considerations in relation to reliability, because we know before an auditor makes his opinion on the financial statements, then he has to have information that is reliable. We've explained how that can be done. Then we've given some additional procedures that an auditor can carry out, specifically in relation to inventory and group audits. So thank you for your time. I will meet you in our next session, where we will consider maybe other audit procedures. But generally, we've done what is required of the subtopic effects of pandemics on audit procedures. In our last session, we covered the concept of remote auditing. Today, we have done additional procedures to put in place to obtain sufficient audit evidence. There is a question that was tested in December 2021. Advanced Auditing and Assurance, question number 1. I want you to attempt the question. Then if you have any other questions in relation to the contemporary issues, feel free to post your questions. But as far as the syllabus is concerned, we've covered topic number 10, contemporary issues. The syllabus required candidates to study the professional and ethical developments, which you have done. The second subtopic is other current issues, which we have covered. Today we have completed the effects of pandemics on audit processes. If you have questions, you can send the questions and we will answer all your questions. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.